Jonathan Hayes had built Burger Haven from the ground up, transforming a single roadside diner into a nationwide fast food empire. But lately, success tasted hollow. Profits were higher than ever, yet whispers of employee mistreatment, dwindling morale, and mismanagement reached his ears too often. The reports painted a picture he couldn't ignore: long hours, unfair wages, and a toxic work culture that didn't reflect the values he once cherished. Sitting in his penthouse office, Jonathan realized spreadsheets and board meetings couldn't show him the truth. He needed to see it for himself. A week later, Jack Harris, a man with a weathered face, a second-hand uniform, and a fabricated past, stepped through the doors of one of the busiest Burger Haven locations in the city. The air smelled of sizzling grease, overworked fryers, and something less tangible: tension. It clung to the employees like an invisible weight, manifesting in their hurried steps and hollow smiles. A teenage boy manned the register, his fingers moving swiftly over the touchscreen as he greeted customers with forced enthusiasm. His uniform was a little too big for his wiry frame, the sleeves rolled up to keep from slipping past his wrists. He looked like he should be hanging out with friends after school, not standing for hours under fluorescent lights. Jonathan approached the counter, rehearsing his cover story, new to town, desperate for work, willing to do whatever was needed. The boy turned, flashing a polite but tired smile. "Hey, welcome to Burger Haven. Here for the interview." Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, name's Jack." Before the boy could respond, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "You the new guy?" A man in his 40s strode toward them, stocky, with a permanent scowl carved into his face. His name tag read Rick Thompson, General Manager. The way employees avoided his gaze spoke volumes. Jonathan extended a hand. "Jack Harris, thanks for the opportunity." Rick barely glanced at it. "You got experience?" "A little. Been out of work for a bit, but I'll do whatever's needed." Rick snorted. "Yeah? We'll see." He turned without another word. "Follow me." Jonathan cast one last glance at the cashier, who gave him a small, sympathetic shrug before turning back to his customers. The office was cluttered, smelling faintly of burnt coffee. Rick dropped a stack of papers in front of him. "Fill these out. Fast." Jonathan picked up the pen and skimmed the documents: employment forms, non-disclosure agreements, an acknowledgement of company policies. He signed where required, suppressing a smirk. If only Rick knew whose signature he was looking at. "You're on kitchen duty and backup cashier. Minimum wage. No free meals. No breaks if we're slammed. Understood?" Jonathan nodded. He expected the low pay, but the lack of breaks? That was illegal. He kept his expression neutral. "Understood." Rick grunted. "Good. Uniforms are in the back. Be on the floor in 10. Jonathan changed quickly, stepping into the chaotic rhythm of the kitchen. The heat was stifling, the fryers bubbling nonstop, as workers hustled to keep up with orders. A young woman with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun caught sight of him struggling with the grill and let out a small laugh. "You look lost, new guy." Jonathan turned to find her smirking at him. Her name tag read Emily. "Not lost," he said, flipping a patty that sizzled violently. "Just adjusting." She snorted. "That's a fancy way of saying you don't know what you're doing." He chuckled. "Fair enough." She took the spatula from his hands with an exaggerated sigh. "All right, Jack. Let me show you how to survive this place." Emily worked quickly, her movements efficient but unhurried. As she guided him through the process, her sharp wit softened into something more genuine. He noticed the way she glanced toward the front, her gaze lingering on the cashier, the boy from earlier. "That kid, David," Jonathan said, keeping his voice casual. "He seems hardworking." Emily's expression tightened. "Yeah, he is. Works his ass off, actually. And Rick treats him like garbage." Jonathan followed her gaze. David was handling the dinner rush alone, his fingers flying over the register as he juggled orders. A woman with 2 young kids was struggling with her payment, and instead of rushing her, David leaned in with a reassuring smile. "No worries, ma'am. Take your time." The moment was fleeting, But Jonathan saw it: kindness, patience, a natural ability to put people at ease. Qualities of a leader, not just an employee. Emily exhaled sharply. Kid works double shifts most days. Has a sick mom at home. Rick knows it and still rides him harder than anyone. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He had seen managers like Rick before, men who thrived on power, who mistook cruelty for control. As the night wore on, he saw more. Employees skipping meals because they couldn't afford to eat where they worked. Rick berating a girl for not wiping a table fast enough. The subtle, constant erosion of morale, like a tide pulling away at the shore. And then, toward closing, came the moment that made Jonathan's breath catch. David was counting the register, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. Emily leaned against the counter, watching him with a sad smile. "If only the CEO knew how we suffer," she murmured, voice quiet but laced with frustration. "But he's probably in some mansion, counting his money." Jonathan felt the words like a physical blow. He had expected to see flaws, expected to find areas where his company could improve. But this was something deeper. This was disillusionment, betrayal. And he was the cause of it. He swallowed hard, pushing down the sharp sting of guilt. He had come looking for the truth. Now, he had to decide what to do with it. The morning shift began with the sharp clang of the fryer basket hitting the counter. Grease sizzled, the air thick with the smell of oil and overuse. Jonathan adjusted his cap and moved toward the grill, still getting used to the rhythm of the kitchen. It had been 3 days since he started at Burger Haven, and already, the cracks in the system were impossible to ignore. David was already at the register, his fingers moving quickly over the screen, his voice steady as he greeted customers. The exhaustion on his face was more pronounced today, deep circles under his eyes. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly. He worked with the quiet precision of someone who had no choice but to push through. Emily stood near the soda machine, watching Rick berate a young employee over improperly stacked trays. The girl, barely out of high school, nodded quickly, her hands shaking as she corrected the mistake. Rick didn't stop. His voice carried over the restaurant, loud enough for customers to glance up, eyes darting between their meals and the unfolding humiliation. Jonathan clenched his fists, biting back the urge to intervene. He had to see how far this went. The first real warning sign came when he took a short break in the back storage room. He leaned against a stack of boxes, wiping sweat from his forehead, when David walked in, stretching his arms with a quiet groan. Jonathan hesitated before speaking. "You good?" David exhaled a tired laugh. "Yeah, just another day." Jonathan studied him for a moment. "You work a lot of doubles." David shrugged. "Gotta do what I gotta do." He hesitated, then sat down on an overturned crate. "My mom's been sick for a while. Can't work anymore. It's just me and my little sister." Jonathan felt a familiar pang in his chest. He had grown up watching his own father struggle, working long hours to put food on the table. But there had been safety nets, family, connections. David had none of that. "How long you been here?" Jonathan asked. "Almost a year." Jonathan frowned. "No raise." David let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Rick doesn't do raises. Says we should be grateful we have jobs." Jonathan's grip tightened around the edge of the crate. A sharp voice rang from the front. "David." "Break's over." David sighed, pushing himself to his feet. "Back to it." Jonathan watched him go, a slow-burning anger rising in his chest. He had built Burger Haven on the promise of opportunity, an entry-level job that could grow into something more. Instead, here was a kid giving everything he had and getting nothing in return. Later that evening, during the dinner rush, Jonathan saw firsthand how deep the problems ran. Orders piled up, the kitchen struggling to keep pace. The fryer beeped relentlessly, and the drive-through line stretched into the parking lot. Rick hovered behind the counter, barking orders, his presence adding more chaos than control. Emily handed a tray to a customer, then turned toward Jonathan, her expression grim. "We're supposed to have 6 people on the floor right now," she murmured, wiping her hands on a rag. Rick cut shifts again. Jonathan's stomach turned. "Why?" Labor costs, she said bitterly. He wants to look good for corporate. Says if we work harder, we don't need the extra hands. Jonathan glanced around. He had noticed the empty stations, the missing faces from previous shifts. Employees were stretched thin, juggling multiple roles, their movements frantic. It wasn't just poor management, it was intentional neglect. A commotion near the register pulled his attention. A customer, red-faced and frustrated, waved his receipt in the air. "This isn't what I ordered." David apologized quickly, his voice calm despite the man's rising anger. "I'm really sorry about that. I can fix it right now." Rick stepped in before David could. "You messing up orders again?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise of the restaurant. David stiffened. "It was just a mix-up." "I don't need excuses." Rick snatched the receipt from the customer's hand. "Fix it and stop wasting time." Jonathan saw the flicker of humiliation cross David's face, the way his hands trembled as he re-entered the order. Emily muttered under her breath, "He's been looking for a reason to fire him." Jonathan's jaw clenched. The final straw came just before closing. David was finishing the register count, carefully stacking bills, when Rick loomed over him. "You short?" David shook his head. "No, sir. Everything's accounted for." Rick grabbed the stack of bills and flipped through them. His lips curled. "This doesn't look right." David frowned. "I triple-checked it. It's correct." Rick turned to the room. "Anyone see him take cash?" Silence. Emily's eyes went wide. "Are you serious?" Rick ignored her. "I've been keeping an eye on him. Too many mistakes. Too many close calls." David's face drained of color. "I would never." Rick cut him off. "You're done. Hand over your uniform." Jonathan stepped forward, his pulse pounding. "That's not right." Rick sneered. "Stay out of this, new guy. You don't know how things work here." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. He had seen enough. The facade was over. It was time for the truth. The restaurant had gone eerily silent. Employees froze mid-task, their eyes darting between Rick and David, the tension thick as fryer grease. A few customers lingered near the counter, pretending not to eavesdrop, but clearly invested in the unfolding drama. David's hands clenched at his sides. His voice wavered, but he held his ground. "I didn't take anything." Rick scoffed, flipping through the bills in his hand as if the proof of David's guilt would magically appear. "You expect me to believe that? You're always hanging around the register, always working extra hours. Probably figured no one would notice a few bucks missing." Jonathan stepped forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He double-checked the count. "The numbers are fine." Rick turned on him with a sneer. "Stay out of this, Jack. You don't even work the register. You don't know what you're talking about." Jonathan held his gaze. "I know enough." Rick's upper lip curled. "Look, if you want to walk out with him, be my guest. But I run this store, and I say he's done." David's breathing was uneven, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the counter. He wasn't fighting just for his job. He was fighting for his home, his mother, his little sister. Jonathan could see it in his eyes, the sheer desperation of someone who had no safety net, no other options. Rick moved to grab the name tag off David's uniform, but Jonathan caught his wrist. The action was small, controlled, but the room shifted around them. Rick's face darkened. "You just made a mistake," Jonathan said, his voice steady. He released Rick's wrist and took a step back. Then he reached up and pulled off his cap. Emily gasped. David blinked in confusion. A murmur rippled through the employees. Rick's expression twisted into something between confusion and irritation. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "My name isn't Jack Harris." He met each of their eyes, his voice clear and unwavering. "I'm Jonathan Hayes, CEO of Burger Haven." Silence crashed over the room like a tidal wave. Emily's mouth parted slightly, her gaze flickering between him and Rick. David's face drained of what little color remained. Rick took a step back, letting out a disbelieving laugh. "Yeah, right." But there was something uncertain in his voice, a crack in his confidence. Jonathan reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a sleek black business card embossed with the company's official logo, and his full name in silver lettering. He let it drop onto the counter between them. Rick's smirk faltered. A single breath passed before Emily let out something between a gasp and a laugh. "Oh my God." Jonathan turned toward David. "You're not fired." David swallowed hard, his hands shaking as if he wasn't sure whether to believe what was happening. Rick, however, recovered quickly. He straightened, puffing out his chest, and plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hayes, if I had known you were coming, I would have ensured everything was up to standard." Jonathan turned his full attention on him. "That's exactly why I didn't announce it." Rick hesitated. Jonathan gestured around the restaurant. "I've been here for days. I've seen the way you run this place. The understaffing, the cut shifts, the way you berate your employees in front of customers." His voice hardened. "And now, you're fabricating accusations to fire one of the hardest working people here." Rick's expression shifted from forced charm to something more dangerous. "I'm following policy." Jonathan stepped closer. "You're abusing it." A beat of silence stretched between them, the power dynamic shifting entirely. Jonathan had spent his career dealing with men like Rick, managers who thrived on control, who ruled with fear because they lacked true leadership. Rick's hands twitched at his sides. His mind was scrambling for a way out. Jonathan made it easy for him. "You're done." Rick's eyes snapped to his. "Excuse me. You're fired." Rick let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "You can't just." "I can." Jonathan's voice was razor-sharp. "And I am." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but the weight of the room pressed against him. Employees who had once cowered under his authority now stood straighter. Emily crossed her arms, an almost smug glint in her eyes. David exhaled, the relief washing over his face so palpable that it nearly cracked Jonathan's composure. Security arrived minutes later. Rick sputtered a few last threats, but they were empty now. His reign over this small kingdom had ended. As soon as the door swung shut behind him, the room erupted into a low murmur. Employees whispered to one another, stunned. Jonathan turned to the staff, taking in their wary, uncertain faces. Then he looked at David. "You work harder than anyone here," Jonathan said. "And you deserve to be recognized for that." David blinked, still processing. "Sir." Jonathan smiled, the first genuine one he had offered all night. "Congratulations. You're the new shift supervisor." The room stilled again, but this time, the silence felt different, charged with something lighter. David's mouth opened, then closed. I don't know what to say." Emily clapped him on the back. "Say yes, dummy." David let out a breathless laugh. "Yes. Definitely yes." The tension in the air finally cracked, replaced by something like hope. For the first time since stepping into Burger Haven, Jonathan felt like he had done something real. This wasn't the end. There were more problems to fix, more people to hold accountable. But tonight, in this store, change had begun. The restaurant felt different. The thick, oppressive tension that had once clung to every surface had lifted, replaced with something fragile yet hopeful. Employees moved with lighter steps, exchanging cautious glances as if testing whether the change was real. The space Rick had occupied for so long, his presence a dark cloud over the staff, was now empty. And in his place, David stood behind a register, not just another overworked cashier, but a newly promoted shift supervisor. David adjusted his name tag, the new title still foreign to him. He kept glancing at it, as if at any moment someone might rip it away and tell him this had all been a mistake. But it wasn't. Emily leaned against the counter, watching him with a smirk. "You're going to wear out that name tag if you keep messing with it." David let out a shaky laugh. "I still can't believe it." Jonathan, standing nearby, folded his arms. "Believe it. You earned this." David met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Respect, gratitude, maybe even disbelief that someone in power had actually seen him. The night crew worked with a renewed energy, voices lighter, conversations less guarded. It wasn't just about Rick being gone. It was about what his departure represented. They had been heard. They had been seen. But Jonathan knew his work wasn't done. The next morning, he arrived at the store before opening. dressed in his usual tailored suit instead of the grease-stained uniform of Jack Harris. He had spent years at the top, making decisions based on reports and spreadsheets, trusting that his managers were upholding the values Burger Haven had been built on. That trust had been misplaced. He sat at a booth near the window, watching as the early morning crew filtered in. Some of them spotted him and hesitated, unsure of how to act around the man who had, until last night, been just another employee. Emily approached first, sliding into the seat across from him, without hesitation. "So what's the plan, boss?" Jonathan smirked. "Straight to business, huh?" She shrugged. "Well, you don't seem like the type to shake things up and then disappear." He nodded, glancing toward the counter where David was setting up for the morning rush. "That's why I'm here." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "You really care about this place, don't you?" Jonathan exhaled, his gaze sweeping over the restaurant. "I built Burger Haven to be more than just another fast food chain. I wanted it to be a place where people could start from the bottom and work their way up, like I did." He shook his head. "Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what was happening on the ground." Emily leaned back, arms crossed. "So what now?" Jonathan drummed his fingers on the table. "First, we implement better oversight. Regular undercover visits. Not just from me, but from corporate leadership." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Undercover boss, but make it a routine?" Jonathan chuckled. "Something like that." His expression sobered. "We also need to fix how we treat employees. Better wages, actual career growth opportunities, and managers who lead with respect, not fear." Emily nodded slowly. "That's a start." The morning rush began, and Jonathan watched as David handled the orders with ease, assisting new hires, cracking jokes with customers. He was a natural leader, not because of a title, but because he genuinely cared. Before Jonathan left, he pulled David aside. "One more thing." David straightened. "Yes, sir?" Jonathan smiled. "It's Jonathan." David chuckled. "Right. Sorry. What's up?" Jonathan reached into his pocket and handed him a small envelope. "Consider this your first supervisor bonus." David hesitated before opening it, his eyes widening at the check inside. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Sir, this is—" "You've been carrying more than your fair share for too long," Jonathan said. "Take care of your family. And take care of this place." David's grip on the envelope tightened. "I will." Jonathan nodded, clapping him on the shoulder before stepping toward the door. Before he left, he turned back, taking in the restaurant one last time. Things weren't perfect. They never would be. But change had begun, and this was only the beginning.